My name is Cheryl Harris, and I'm very nervous making this video, so I'm reading off of a script that I prepared. The script also is going to be loaded up as a public document on my Facebook page if anybody wants to read it. Anyway, I am 49 years old. I live in Florida. I'm single with no children. I am a lawyer who is currently unemployed, and I currently have health care now because of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's also called. I have a birth defect that the health insurance industry considers a pre-existing condition, a minor one, and I also have gaps in my U.S. health insurance coverage. So I have been refused health insurance by major U.S. carriers. Even though I am healthy and have no chronic illnesses, even though until 2009 I had never been without health coverage so far as I can remember. Until 2009, when I was denied insurance coverage here in the US. I was, until that time, absolutely living in a protected, ignorant bubble as to what was going on in the US health insurance industry. Today, when I explain to people how I've ended up in this situation, without access to private health insurance, and mention some other facts I have since discovered about healthcare in the U.S., the reaction tends to be one of, "You're kidding, that can't be right." I talked to a really good friend of mine last week about this. She works for a major corporation and is someone I consider very intelligent and usually pretty well informed. Though this time she said to me, "Is it true that there are people who have gone bankrupt because of medical costs?" She's not alone in being ignorant about the issues surrounding healthcare reform. I encounter it all the time now. And until 3 years ago, I was just like that. So I've decided to tell my story and also some other stories that I know. Because a lot of us are very afraid of what could happen if Governor Romney is elected president, simply because he proclaims in bold print and all capital letters on his website, "My first act, out with Obamacare." To be honest, I have issues with some of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act, primarily in relation to implementation of the individual mandate and how states are supposed to implement their portions of the ACA. But I believe the answer is to work with the existing legislation and amend it as needed, not repeal it. Because I truly am concerned that if it's repealed, I and millions of others like me, including children, may never have health insurance again in the US. And that means I will never have affordable health care here again either. As a side note, I am not against the healthcare industry making profits. Nor am I against capitalism. Pharmaceutical companies need profits in order to finance research and development of new drugs, including testing and meeting FDA standards. I want doctors and hospitals that are up to date on medical issues, have good equipment, educated and sufficient staff, and are able to handle the increasing number of patients in this country as our population keeps growing. They can't do that without profits. But there is also definitely reform that can be done with respect to healthcare providers, though I honestly don't think that can happen until the health insurance industry and medical malpractice suits are first brought under control. Health insurance companies, though, that's another beast. Chief executives of those companies are pulling down 7-8-figure salaries, including bonuses. These companies have stockholders who expect dividends and profits. Apologies to my friends who work in this area, but that an entire industry of medical coding has arisen because of the demands of insurance companies seems a waste of resources and money. When I was in college, I worked as a billing clerk for an amniocentesis clinic. I didn't need any special training to fill out the Blue Cross Blue Shield forms or the other medical insurance forms, so I'm not quite sure how this has become such a complicated thing. It all just seems off to me on some very fundamental level that companies ancillary to healthcare, like insurance, are able to profit to such an extent from our basic health needs. But let me make one thing very clear. I'm not here seeking to have the government subsidize me or give me free health care. Right now, I just want the federal government to regulate the healthcare industry so that people with pre-existing conditions cannot be discriminated against and cut off entirely from health insurance. I was born in January 1963 with several non-life-threatening birth defects, and you can probably see one of them as you watch this video because I do have a lazy eye muscle. However, the one at issue here is a mild leak in one of my heart valves, which went undetected until I was an adult, which is not uncommon. The technical term is mitral valve prolapse. It has zero impact on my life. There are no restrictions as to what I can do physically, so long as I see a cardiologist once a year to keep tabs on it, watch my weight, eat healthily, and exercise regularly. It should cause me absolutely no problems, barring something else entering the picture, the course of my whole life. The leaky valve is something that runs on my father's side of the family. He had it. His leak got worse when he underwent chemotherapy treatment for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Since some of his arteries were also blocked, possibly as a result of his being a smoker his entire life, he underwent bypass and valve repair surgery in 1997. And as of today, as I'm recording this, he is very much still alive. I've never smoked. I'm actually allergic to it. I don't take any prescription medication currently. I've battled with my weight since puberty, but I've never been severely overweight. Having health insurance was something that my mom hammered into me from an early age. So even when I went to business school and then on to law school, I made sure I was covered. I don't have the records for my entire life, but I'm fairly certain that I had continuous coverage from childhood until October 2005 here in the U.S., except for possibly some 3-month waiting periods before benefits would kick in for a new job, because that's the way it used to be. But I tried to be careful about this because you just never know what's going to happen, and that's what my mom always told me. In 2003, I left my job as a prosecutor in the Bronx to pursue some dreams, and I went to graduate school in London. But I kept my home in New York City, and first through COBRA and then through an individual plan with the same insurer, I kept my health insurance coverage. Then I got a job with one of the biggest law firms in the world in their London office. I had to sell my home in New York, though. I really loved some of my doctors in New York City, though, and I knew I'd be back at least once a year and could see them then. I also wasn't very clear at that time about how the health system in the UK worked, but I did know that I would not be enrolled in U.S. health insurance there through my firm. So I contacted my insurer in New York and asked to see if I could keep my insurance. Their answer was, no, you won't have a residence in New York anymore, so you can't stay insured here. And with that, my U.S. insurance coverage lapsed in October 2005. In London, though, I was covered under the NHS. I also purchased the private insurance coverage offered by my law firm, so that if I wanted to, I would have affordable access to some of the private specialists and doctors that aren't part of the NHS. And that way escape some of the waiting times for non-urgent appointments and procedures that can occur with the NHS. It's a very good system, but it's not perfect. I went for my regular physicals, pap smears, mammograms, and echocardiograms. I never spent a day there not covered for my health care, and I made sure to take care of my health. I was in a country with top medical care, so I really never thought I'd have any problems when I came back to the U.S. In March 2009, for various reasons, I moved back here. Unfortunately, my decision to move came just as all the layoffs and hiring freezes hit the legal industry, as well as many, many other industries. So my law firm couldn't transfer me to one of their U.S. offices. I moved back anyway, and knew I would have to find a job. But one of my first priorities was also to get health insurance. During my move, though, I badly strained a shoulder muscle, lifting boxes. I went to see a chiropractor for a series of treatments pretty much as soon as I got here because the pain was pretty intense. But it was a temporary injury, and once finished the treatments, I would be fine. as I was receiving treatment for my shoulder, I submitted an application for health insurance to Aetna through my state bar association, of which I was a member. Colleagues had recommended it to me since I would receive a group rate through it. I was completely honest and open on my application, included all physicians, diagnoses, and medical history that was asked for, including the names of my doctors in London and the private health insurance carrier I had had there. Aetna got back to me a couple of weeks later and told me that my application was denied based on my, quote, having treatment for back problems and, quote, a history of congenital leaky heart valve, mitral valve prolapse. Okay, this was a bit of a surprise. I decided to forego trying to get group insurance, which I thought might be the problem, and instead turned to my long-term health insurer, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and applied for an individual plan. They turned me down for having a history of neck and back pain with current symptoms and treatment. Both insurers made it clear that their decisions were final. Neither came back to me suggesting that I look into another plan of theirs that might cost more per month or have higher deductibles, or even to say, okay, we'll carry you, but you have to pay for the shoulder treatment. I would have been fine with that. Neither bothered actually talking to me on the phone or requesting a physical examination, which would have shown me to be in great health. Before life insurance is sold, insurers require a basic physical exam and blood test. I think it's perfectly reasonable before health insurance coverage is approved to require a similar type of exam. There's people who fraudulently, apply for health insurance. But more importantly, all health insurance applications ask whether you have been previously turned down for insurance coverage and any such details. The more no's you have to report, well, I was advised by several people to stop applying after I received 2, because I'm going to have to keep reporting them for a long time. A friend then suggested that I look into a high-risk pool of insurance that states carry. But the state I was living in at the time, Georgia, didn't have one. They still don't. So I had no health insurance. And I was looking for a job just when the economy was probably at its worst. Without being able to get insurance on my own, I couldn't hang out a shingle or start a business. I needed to find a job with a company that would provide me with health benefits, and there weren't many of those around. About a year later, there started to be more opportunities for me back up in New York City, so I moved from Georgia to just across the river from New York City in New Jersey. But the night before my move, I stumbled in a garage and fell right on my face, smack on the concrete. My glasses broke, and there was a gash. It's right here just above my right eyebrow, and little bits of glass got in it. And the bleeding was pretty bad and hadn't stopped after about 30 minutes, and so I went to the nearest emergency room. 5 stitches later, there was a bill for over $1,000. And then the bill for the doctor up north who removed the stitches. And then the bills for the eye doctor I needed to see to make sure there had actually not been damage to my eye itself. And also for replacement glasses. Several $1,000s gone just like that for what was a fairly minor fall. It never occurred to me to try to have any of the prices reduced on the bills or to even get them waived because I was unemployed. I'm fortunate I have some money tucked away, though after extended unemployment it's running low. I just paid the bills in full. Anyway, my old law firm eventually lifted its freeze. But they only wanted to offer me a 6-month probationary contract in their New York City office. And this was after working 3.5 years in their London office. At a salary less than half of what I should have been making. But still requiring me to meet the 2,000-hour billable mark, like everybody else. The carrot being dangled, though, was full health benefits. I had, in my discussions with them, told them about the problems I encountered with getting health insurance. full health benefits is not something that many contract employees are offered. I took it. After the 6 months ended, instead of offering me a regular full salaried position, I was given quote-unquote wonderful news. They wanted to extend my contract for another 12 months with a slight pay raise. There's just a lot of reasons, but I couldn't do it, not even for health benefits. I went on COBRA for a couple of months, but it was way too expensive, so I stopped it. Then personal reasons brought me to Florida last June, where I'm still unemployed but looking, and in the meanwhile I'm doing volunteer work at the local courts. Fortunately, President Obama signed into law the Affordable Care Act. Part of the ACA is the Pre-Existing Condition Insurance Plan, or PCIP, which is for people like me who can't get an individual plan because of pre-existing conditions and have been without health insurance for at least 6 months. PCIP covers the states that high-risk insurance pools don't exist in. Florida is one of them, so PCIP was here. As soon as I was eligible, I applied. Was accepted, and now I pay $270 a month for pretty basic coverage. It's not as good as the coverage I've had in the past, but if something major happens, I'm covered. And I'm able to get my annual physicals, preventative care. For example, the flu shot I just got was covered. But basically what my story comes down to is that I'm someone who has always tried to make sure I had health insurance. But because I was born with a minor birth defect in my heart and went to live in England for a few years, where I still had perfectly fine health coverage, and then hurt my shoulder lifting some boxes, moving back, the U.S. health insurance industry has shut its door in my face. If denying people health insurance coverage on the basis of non-life-threatening birth defects isn't discrimination, I'm not sure what is. If Governor Romney is elected and on the first or second day of his presidency repeals the ACA, I would expect that my insurance through PCIP would disappear, since PCIP is only in existence because of the Affordable Care Act, as it would for however many others are enrolled in PCIP. There would be no more requirements on the healthcare insurers to accept people for individual plans who have pre-existing conditions and gaps in coverage. This part is supposed to happen in 2014 under the ACA. So I'd be pretty much back in the same boat that I was in 2009. Without insurance, if something major happens like a cancer diagnosis, I will likely financially be wiped out. The thing is that there's just no way that there would be legislation to replace the ACA at the time Governor Romney repealed it. It takes months, if not years, for this kind of legislation to go through Congress, if Congress is even so inclined to address the issue. So there would be no regulations other than already existing ones, such as the 1996 HIPAA law, under which someone who has continuous coverage through employer plans cannot be denied coverage for pre-existing conditions, although there's some exemptions and loopholes through that. There's a very good article from factcheck.org which covers this in more detail that they released this month. Many other adults would be in similar straits, especially those who have been unemployed for long periods of time. COBRA only lasts 18 months, and for many it's just unaffordable when you're unemployed. So there are many people out there with gaps in insurance coverage who will have pre-existing conditions according to health insurers. And if a health insurer is refusing me coverage now, does anyone seriously think they're going to accept $8,000 from me when I'm a senior? But I and other adults with pre-existing conditions aren't the only ones who would be impacted by the repeal of the ACA. There's actually a much more important group of people to think about in relation to this. Children and babies. Prior to the ACA, health insurers were regularly denying coverage to children with pre-existing conditions. In one friend's case, her health insurer informed her that because her son was born prematurely and had asthma as a result, they would not cover him under her insurance plan. Asthma. Because he was born prematurely. Through no fault of his. She's not alone in having this happen. There have been lots of examples written over the last several years about children being denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions and premature births. Coverage of children with pre-existing conditions was required almost immediately by the ACA. If it's repealed, so is that provision. I have no doubt that insurance carriers would move to drop coverage of those children that they've been forced to insure, given the opportunity, and go back to their old practices of denying coverage for children born with pre-existing conditions, however loosely defined that may be. I know several people who have had children this past year. Some of those babies have had to have surgery for various reasons because of birth defects. Some were born prematurely. If the ACA is repealed, and if they are self-insured families, I'm really scared for those kids. Health insurers were likely also, without regulations in place, continue to drop people from coverage when they develop a pre-existing condition, as they had been doing prior to passage of the ACA. I have friends who are Romney supporters. She is a recent breast cancer survivor. I don't know what their insurance situation is, whether they are self-insured or if they're covered through an employer plan. But if they're self-insured, the odds are high that she will be dropped from their coverage if the ACA is repealed, just as many other breast and other cancer survivors have been. Then there's Governor Romney's pledge on his website to, quote, limit federal standards and requirements on both private insurance and Medicaid coverage, unquote. I'm not entirely sure what he means by this, but I do remember that prior to the passage of the ACA, there was lobbying being done to remove the HIPAA restrictions and free up employers entirely from having to insure employees with pre-existing conditions. So I do wonder what Governor Romney's intentions regarding the 1996 regulations are. If those go, millions more would be without insurance. It scares me to think about where the health insurance industry can go without being regulated. At what point do they start asking for family history and, as an example, begin denying women coverage if there's a history of breast cancer in their family? More importantly, allowing so many to go without insurance, and then most likely because of cost of medical care, it's just counterintuitive. First off, don't we want a healthy workforce? Second, another friend of mine works for a big corporation. He'd love to start his own business, but he and his daughter have what is considered to be a pre-existing condition, and he knows he wouldn't be able to get health insurance for them if he strikes out on his own. So instead of creating new jobs, he's just staying in his old one. Many others are making the same decision. So our economy is being hurt by allowing health insurers to do just what they please and discriminate against those with pre-existing conditions. So someone doesn't have insurance and is at the point where medical care isn't affordable. What happens then? This is a bit of a segue, but it's an important point. In an interview, Governor Romney mentioned that someone can always get emergency care because under federal law, hospitals are required to treat all people in those cases. Of course, hospitals then have to eat the cost for those who can't pay and don't have insurance, which then adds to the, quote, cost of health care problem, and is something that the ACA is trying to avoid. Except that some hospitals are now instituting a screening policy for emergency care because of overcrowding. Cases that they don't feel are true emergencies are sent away. Only that doesn't work 100% of the time. HCA, a hospital system which is being lauded for the profits it's able to make, 40% of it is owned by Bain Capital and KKR, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. It's instituted such a screening protocol in its hospitals, several of which are in Florida. There are concerns about this screening policy, though, and regulators in several states have admonished HCA hospitals for situations where screening missed serious conditions. An HCA hospital in Florida was even fined for turning away someone who was feverish with a artificial heart valve. He then came back 2 days later with worse symptoms, but died the next day. There are other issues with how HCA is achieving its profits. There's a very interesting New York Times profile about them that's dated August 14th, 2012, which I urge people to read. Governor Romney feels the state should step in and take care of the uninsured and those of us with pre-existing conditions. That's his position on his website and in statements released by his campaign. Currently, though, 23 states plus the District of Columbia don't provide what are known as high-risk insurance pools for those with pre-existing conditions. They haven't for years. Why would they suddenly turn around now and provide opportunities for people like me? Specifically, Florida has a governor, Rick Scott, who was against the Affordable Care Act. So much so that he formed a group, Conservatives for Patients' Rights, to lobby against it. And again, there's a good write-up of it in the New York Times dated April 2nd, 2009. When that didn't work, he ran for governor of Florida. And he's announced that Florida will not implement 2 major yet optional portions of the ACA, but it will implement the mandatory provisions if, so long as the act isn't repealed. And he announced this only after the Supreme Court handed down its ruling upholding the ACA. But if the ACA is repealed, I'm very skeptical about what Governor Scott will do here in Florida in relation to establishing insurance pools for those of us with pre-existing conditions, because he made his fortune in the healthcare industry, specifically as the founder of Columbia Healthcare Corporation, which he merged with HCA. And the company is now just known as HCA. And yes, this is the same HCA that I was just talking about earlier. The HCA that Bain Capital partly owns. Governor Scott proudly talks about his association with HCA on his official website. He says that when he left, the company was one of the, quote, most admired companies in America, end quote. That's not quite accurate. What he doesn't mention is the huge fraud investigation of Columbia HCA in the late 1990s, which led to a huge settlement with Medicare. Governor Scott was never accused of wrongdoing, but he was removed as chief executive by the board. One final point on the state issue. It's been argued to me that regulation of the health insurance industry should be by the states because insurance plans are state-based. First, since Governor Romney wants people to be able to purchase insurance across state lines, then we're going to be talking about interstate commerce. Second, it's a fallacy in this day and age to think that insurance plans are state-based. I was working in New York City, living in New Jersey, for an international law firm with offices all around the U.S., but whose primary office in the U.S. was considered to be in Maryland, but all the employees were being covered under a health insurance plan based in California. How can regulation of health insurance corporations be considered a state issue? A few concluding thoughts. My own personal experience is that health insurers are latching on to whatever they can to declare that someone has a pre-existing condition and then discriminating against them by completely refusing them coverage, while at the same time making such profits that executives have multi-million-dollar salaries, while there's many out here who are going broke or dying because they don't have access to insurance. If the Affordable Care Act is repealed, these insurers are going to just continue to walk all over the general public and find more ways to deny coverage and increase their profits. They need to be regulated badly so that millions like me and babies and children can have health insurance and be healthy, productive members of our economy. Vowing to repeal the Affordable Care Act and wanting to take away even more restrictions on health insurance companies, that one thing alone means I'm voting for the re-election of President Obama. All of you should think seriously about this issue, because it's way too easy for health insurers to determine that a person or a child has a pre-existing condition, or for a mother to have a baby born prematurely.